is he?" my son inquired, pointing to the tall figure drawn upon the dusty, nearly crumbling page. As a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction, the history book could have easily been mistaken for the mad scribblings of troglodytes in their fire-lit caves. "A great leader," I replied. "Few remember his name anymore. Washington, I believe it was, though it's quite likely I've been told many a falsehood by the ones who call themselves historians." I chuckled ruefully, as did my son. "Tell me what a leader is," he said. "Where I came from, it was not unusual for children to be demandingly curious. From what I've heard, leaders were people who created order out of chaos," I told him. "Many had great visions for what the world could be like, or in Washington's case, what his country could be like. No doubt he's rolling in his grave now that everything he worked hard to instate has fallen to ruin." By now, my son had put the old book aside and was peering out of the red-tinted window wistfully, his chin resting on his arms, which were in turn resting on the steel windowsill. And he said to me in a serious tone, "I want to be a leader." It broke my heart to hear that he had developed an unattainable dream. A dream I would have to shoot down before long. Such was the treatment all dreams were met with in those times. But the sadness I felt then seemed silly to me now that I wonder in vain. What has become of his poor soul? He could be anywhere, or nowhere, and it's likely I'll never know. By all that is holy, I only hope he's in a better place than I am now. According to the historians, there was a clear-cut and seemingly unbreakable force called natural law, governing my native planet in ancient times, a set of rules you could follow carefully in order to predict the behavior of things and get where you wanted to be. Of course, there was nothing of that sort to stabilize the era I grew up in. Life was a sick game of chance for us all, a game I wouldn't hesitate to call hellish, if not for the fact that I'm now intimately familiar with the word's true meaning. I decided long ago that the only way to end the game would be to rid the cosmos of the Earth entirely, just as one might excise some malignant growth from an otherwise healthy individual. If there was no hope for us on the little white planet, we might as well bring some balance to the universe and cease to exist, I figured. This idea came to me in a most peculiar manner, worming its way into my consciousness, as though it were the fey whisper of a shadowy muse. I hadn't the foggiest clue how said idea could be carried out, but I searched for one whenever opportune nights presented themselves, whenever the sun ceased to scatter its radiation, never knowing what I might find, if anything. Each night lasted only as long as the Earth's prodigious rotational velocity would allow. I removed my son's evening ration from the icebox and served it to him on a sheet of cardboard, not telling him where the meat came from so he wouldn't be deterred from getting his nourishment. Unbeknownst to him, wild game of the sort found in olden tales had long since gone extinct, leaving only the frozen, emaciated corpses of our own kind to dine on when they turned up now and again. Much of my own childhood was spent consuming the wholesome reserves of beans and rice stockpiled in the bowels of our bunker. But upon parenthood, it became clear to me that my child would not be so fortunate. I'd be lying if I didn't regret bringing him into that broken world many a time. Sustenance was growing scarcer by the day, so I forewent my share that eve. Not that raw human heart sounded very appetizing even in my desperate state. I would have roasted my son's ration for him if physics were cooperating that day, but alas, every attempt at striking a match, let alone igniting a bundle of tinder with one, resulted in a conflagration that lasted but a few milliseconds, expanding outward like a fireball and singeing the hairs on my hand before disappearing entirely. The elements, especially fire, seemed to take on different properties at different times, betraying nary a clear pattern in their fluctuations. This randomness decides the fates of men, and I feared it would soon decide my son's and my own for the worse, before I got the chance to do what I was meant to do. The sun began to race out of sight, heralding a new interval of darkness. It was time. "I'll be back," I said to my son, as I donned my gloves and boots and leather coat, pulled the fur-lined hood over my head, gathered a few miscellaneous implements, and equipped an old but still functional gas mask. I couldn't say when I would be back, due to the unpredictable time currents. Whether I would be back at all was no sure thing either. But some things are better lied about, where children are concerned anyway. My son didn't ask where I was going, for he knew better than to believe I had made up my mind. Plans change with the weather. Speaking of weather, I've always found it rather amusing that the term is said to have once encompassed so few variables. The temperature, the sun, the clouds, the winds, and a few other trifling things. Why, if the historian's words ring true at all, the ancients were a soft lot with no valid cause for worry? I've faced the untraceable whims of a mad god and called them weather, while the history books detail parables about the melancholy nature of rain, which I hear was a phenomenon where tiny drops of pure, crystalline water fell out of the sky. Sounds like a utopian dream to me. Not melancholy in the least. On any occasion, I would have given anything to have rain problems instead of time problems and physics problems. Not to mention problems of other planes of reality, which I now face head-on. Problems I could not label or name for the life of me, or shall I say, for the death of me, as death has since usurped survival as my chiefest goal. There are dark, dark things lurking in the blackness betwixt the celestial bodies, and I have seen them, experienced them, lost myself to them. Give me all your rainy days, O ancient ones, and I'll give you all of my demon-haunted nights. When I put my hand on the steel door handle and pressed down firmly, the pressure in the room changed, and a fierce wind howled through the newly opened gap, before much of the unnerving fumes from outside filled the room. I was on the other side and the door was sealed shut again. The windows of our Spartan, vault-like shelter were heavily tinted, for a reason. To filter out the sun's torrid rays. As a side effect, the tinting prevented us from seeing the landscape as it truly was without wandering out of doors. Now that I was seeing it through my own eyes once again, and not through that blood-red filter without which we would be slowly irradiated to total disfigurement in the daylight minutes. I was simultaneously filled with awe and trepidation. There were massive, windswept dunes of snow heaped upon the horizon. Tall, black towers protruded from many, blotting out dense clusters of stars with their staggering height. And then there was that, what was colloquially known as the Brooding star, a great violet light burning in the sky. The inclination to admire its ominous beauty was familiar to me, as was the converse instinct to avert my gaze to avoid being lured by some insidious trap. To me, it was now second nature to second-guess everything. In the past, I had caught wind of too many horrid legends to be anything but cautious. But now I know from experience where those legends came from. Now I know that I wasn't nearly cautious enough. As always, I surveyed the land in search of a new opportunity to change things some way. Somehow. It was not unusual for the various structures around me to shift positions overnight, or for new objects to come and go with the temporal tide. I noticed something conspicuous in the far distance, but before I wasted any time analyzing it, I withdrew my pocket watch and wound the timer, so that it would alert me in 35 minutes, just a minute short of a full night's length. Then I raised the brass spyglass. I had scavenged in my youth and strove to make out the dark, pointy thing resting in a valley between two knolls of snow. It was a pavilion, I realized. I had seen many of them before, as the historians would often appear in congregations of white tents, ever riding the river of time to hawk their wares, which were debatable curiosities at best, risible forgeries at worst. But this pavilion was black and solitary. The optimist in me was excited, for I was witnessing something of untold promise, while the pessimist in me knew how dangerously far away the tent was, and made my muscles stiffen as if to prevent me from trudging after it. No amount of protection would save me from the radioactive light of day, if I failed to return home in time, that is. The sun, however hot its golden beams may have been, were never enough to thaw the planet. But make no mistake, they never failed to pierce leather and flesh and bone, and bestow ungodly maladies upon anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. I have seen the results of such poisonings, and they were not pretty, unless you're psychotic enough to find prettiness in the gradual necrosis of skin, disintegration of cartilage, and rotting of gray matter. Starting pensively at the point of interest, I made what I now know to be the worst decision of my life. I began a march thither. By this time, the cold was already biting viciously at me, and soon a colossal gust threatened to topple me over, leading me to anchor myself in place by crouching for a time. The filter of my gas mask did a fair enough job at keeping me alive, but the air still smelled faintly of ammonia and a number of other inhospitable chemicals. A headache ensued. The time currents, for one thing, were calm that night, as I discovered when I peeked in my pocket watch and noticed the hands shaking only slightly. I could have used the currents to my advantage had I known the secrets of their workings, but only the historians and their masters knew those. It was rumored that the Black Towers had something to do with it all, and that the historians' masters were in fact the very extraterrestrials responsible for the existence of the towers. But who could have known for sure but the historians and the Star Dwellers themselves? Inquisitive thoughts like these filled the time that elapsed between my outset from home and my arrival at the mysterious pavilion. The tent's canvas walls flapped in the wind as I approached it. Something about it filled me with dread now, especially that I was able to observe it up close. Unnerved for reasons unknown, I would have turned around and fled right then and there, but curiosity and hope still burned in me. Against my better judgment, I walked stealthily toward the entrance flap, swept it aside slowly, and beheld the uncanny presence within. Sitting on the rusty metal grid of a mattressless cot was a robed, hooded figure with his head in his hands, a figure I surmised to be male. The robe, being many sizes too large for the being, covered everything but his pallid hands. He didn't appear to be wearing a gas mask, and thus I was puzzled as to how he managed to breathe the toxic atmosphere freely. More interesting than the weird being himself was the looking glass, large and triangular, situated on an easel of sorts behind him. I was mesmerized by it, for it didn't merely reflect what was before it, but was a veritable window into the amorphous depths of space. I saw on its surface a starlit nebula of many colors, all the while confused about how I could be seeing such a thing so clearly through what appeared otherwise to be a simple, silver-framed mirror. A few wrought iron candelabra were arrayed along the pavilion's margins, and atop their candles danced otherworldly flames that I fancied were the color of lighting. In another world, I perhaps would have called them beautiful, but in that moment they were, to me, horribly redolent of the brooding star. They evoked all the undesirable feelings of helplessness and nausea I would associate with the violet light in the sky, only on a smaller scale. It was in their sticky glow that I noticed a noose curled up beneath the cot. The figure's shallow breathing was his only movement. At this point I began to lose my nerve, what with the uncomfortable silence and the eldritch appearance of all that I was beholding. I checked my pocket watch once more. 20 minutes remained. 15 were required just to make it back home, leaving me with hardly 5 minutes to spare. What could I hope to accomplish in 5 minutes? I wondered. When no answer came to mind, I released the entrance flap and turned my back on the pavilion. It was then that I heard a cold and hollow voice call out in a strange whisper from within the tent behind me. "Father." I was stopped in my tracks. "Father," he said again, his weary call betraying both elation and despair as well as it could. I returned to the tent, this time sauntering all the way in and finding myself face to face with the odd being. His head was no longer buried in the spidery embrace of his pale fingers. The though his face was still wholly obscured by hood and shadow. His breath was visible, and the frigid air and leaked eerily from where his mouth ought to have been. "I've been waiting lifetimes for you, Father." His voice was now incredibly quiet and difficult to interpret. I'm not your... I tried to interrupt, but he kept speaking. "You would think immortality would lead one to higher heights. But nay, it has only led me to this half-life. I have yearned for a feeling of joy, such as that which your arrivals has provided me. A joy I thought I could only experience in the presence of the brooding star itself." A shiver crawled down my spine as he uttered those words, and a morbid curiosity proceeded to overtake me swiftly and inexplicably, a curiosity the likes of which I had never experienced prior. This led me to ask, "What do you know of the brooding star? And how could you possibly know anything about it?" In the past, I had treated with skepticism the legends that the star was some kind of maleficent intelligence that probed the nightmares of hapless victims, apparently in search of something, like a demon, seeking a corpse to possess. Yet there was no denying that it was more than just a queer light with unnerving properties. "It speaks to me," the being said. "For that privilege, I gave up the ability to speak to it, for it does not like to be challenged. But by the ignorant, I gave up my humanity, my face, for this miserable existence, for the opportunity to, what was it? Bring order to chaos." He let out a subhuman sigh. "So long have I carried out this dead life that my own desires have been nearly overshadowed by the androgynous dark, the chaotic light, As the being descended into a paroxysm of mad mumbling, shivering, and whimpering, I became repulsed by him, even though I now subconsciously thought of him as more than just a being. He was a messenger, a prophet, an oracle, but surely not of holy influence or example. He was, at the time, the most unholy creature I ever saw, and yet there was also a pity amid my repulsion. I shouldn't be here," I said in a slight panic. "There's nothing for me here. I'm sorry, I just have to." "You want to know its true name?" the oracle interjected. "I can sense your desire." Before I could tell him otherwise, he profaned my ears and my soul with a distorted utterance that I dare say no mortal man would have been physically able to repeat. It was the ineffable appellation of the brooding star, the dread signature of an alien presence hopelessly beyond human comprehension. The noise awakened entirely new senses in me, inundating my consciousness with indescribable, offensive, extrasensory stimuli, a feeling I would compare to being roused from a dead sleep, having never experienced wakefulness before by the most nightmarish banshee imaginable. That was when I knew I had stumbled upon something my species, or anything endemic to the third dimension, more accurately, was never meant to know. I had been exposed to an evil that confirmed one thing in my eyes. My little white planet had been wholly forsaken by God, left to the mercy of things even he would not dare confront. "Good day," I shouted deliriously, backpedaling toward the entrance so as to make my escape. "No," the oracle screeched, lurching onto his feet. 'Twas a screech much like that of a barn owl and slightly reminiscent of the wailing of a mountain lion, both of which I had heard in allegedly antique recordings. "Our interests are mutual, Father. We both want to put an end to this chaos. I cannot do it without you. Don't you know?" "What do you want with me?" I managed to say. I could have bolted at that moment, but a strangling fear made me anxious about resisting. "I want you to summon the brooding star, lost my grip on reason when I heard him mention the end of the world a second time. It was my desire to see the earth destroyed, and now it appeared fate was on my side. This crazed oracle seemed to be the opportunity I had been seeking all along. And what of my son? I queried, forgetting momentarily that the oracle had illusions about his relationship to me. What will become of him? The oracle stared soundlessly in answer, and I felt his unseen eyes glaring at me from beneath his hood. Trying in vain to consider all the possible ways this scenario could unfold, I examined as many thoughts, reeling inside my head as I could. Finally, I asked, "What must I do?" "Kill me," he begged in a hoarse whisper. "Kill me." That was enough. I couldn't deal with this deranged creature anymore. Fate be damned. I hastily passed back into the starlit night and oriented myself in the direction of home, withdrawing my pocket watch without thought. To my shock, time had all but run out. 1 minute remained. I let out an unrestrained curse. Had that much time really passed? I might have completely lost touch with time while under the influence of the brooding star's foul name. I realized, or perhaps a temporal storm made its way past me without me knowing. Panic shot through me. If I was to end up dead, regardless of my next move, what choice did I have but to turn back and acquiesce to the oracle's mad request? With that, I drew my switchblade and steeled myself for what I thought was about to occur. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually did occur. My hot, stale breath made me dizzy as it collected in my poorly ventilated gas mask, yet it didn't prevent me from storming into the pavilion and taking a successful stab at the oracle's jugular. As he fell back onto the rusty cot, so too did his hood fall back. I instinctively looked away, for I beheld for a millisecond his grotesque, inhumane face. As I cowered, I noticed that my knife and sleeve were stained with blood that was black as tar, not red as I would expect. I heard an airy cackle erupt from the oracle, no doubt the product of a newly damaged voice box, and a long, demented mind. Having made an oath to myself to put an end to this thing's pathetic life, I closed my eyes and stabbed savagely at the oracle's face and neck too many times to count. I felt the projectile spurting of unnaturally cold and vicious blood with every blow. Out of breath, I finally ceased my attack and opened my eyes with caution. His face was now obscured with his own inky bodily fluids, and thus slightly less frightening, but still more revolting than anything I had seen before it. He lay there, gurgling with each breath, mere voiceless air bubbling out of his facial orifices, till he wheezed for the last time and went limp as a beheaded snake. The violet candles mysteriously extinguished themselves upon his death, darkening the already dark area, and the wondrous triangular-looking glass ceased to be wondrous, appearing now to be nothing more than a conventional mirror, spattered with a very much unconventional substance. A sudden gale beat violently against the canvas walls from outside. What have I done? I mumbled to myself. I made my way outside and looked around, noticing immediately that the brooding star was nowhere to be seen. Seemingly extinguished or relocated, how its light managed to disappear so quickly was beyond me. Or the theory of relativity, or a flawed interpretation of it, at least, was not alien to me. Then again, if there was any place the ultimate speed limit of the universe might be broken, it would have been around that blasted plot of space-time whence I came. My pocket watch proceeded to ring stridently, heralding a wave of panic and presaging my doom. Death was now inevitable, though I had a seeming choice of how I would end. Radiation poisoning, chemical poisoning, blood loss, or perhaps hypothermia. Before I could ponder my options deeply, the scorching sun peeked over the horizon. I raised my arm to shield my eyes from the harsh twilight which put me on my knees, knowing deep down that its harmful rays were indeed harming me, but the terrible luminosity was short-lived. For something exponentially more vile soon eclipsed the fiery orb from below and stifled its light. The moment I lowered my arm, I regretted everything. Every decision leading up to that moment and every minute that I continued to live. Blinding in its horror. A great, tentacled mass rose up from the horizon, an indubitable destroyer of the worlds, spreading like a cancer across the crimson sky. There was no sunrise to speak of anymore, but a hellrise, a welling up of unadulterated unnaturalness that could have only originated from the lowest, coldest, darkest spheres of existence. The writhing mass was a storm in its own right. As I look back upon those distorted and nauseating memories, I recall flashes of lightning occurring in the hollows of its colossal, tangled body. But above all, it was an abomination. Everything about it an insult to the world it now loomed above. I dare say no being, God or otherwise, would be capable of forgiving such a heinous monstrosity for its crime of mere existence. Nor would any God choose to protect his creation from its insane wrath at so late a stage. For surely anything it laid its multitudinous eyes and appendages upon would be instantly and forever tainted. A deep, foul moaning soon filled the air, evoking thoughts of a million tormented souls wailing desperately. This sent me to the ground, where I shook uncontrollably. In a fetal position, the experience made me welcome death. And thus, I removed my mask and allowed the noxious air to fill my lungs. My eyes, although shut at this point, detected darkness enveloping me on all sides. Such was the end of my corporeal existence, and the beginning of something far more odious than I could have ever imagined.